obligation. However, I would recommend, sorry, I have a very strong allergy today. Good morning to all. Sorry, I started. I have a very strong allergy today, so it has been a little bit difficult. But just to say on the issue of legality of unilateral measures, I think that deserves a special type of debate and a special type of discussion. Some member states may require, but remember we're the UN and we have an impartiality obligation. So it's important that the issues are discussed in a different manner, in an open manner, so we can try. Now, after the wonderful presentation by Malik, I'm here to complicate your life. So he has given you an overview of NDCs in trade. I'm going to bring you to a total different scenario. We're going now to move from land to the oceans, which where the rules and the economic approach is totally different, okay? So I will be giving you a presentation of recent trends on the ocean economy, some elements about NDCs in SIDS, Small Island Development States, because we have done a mapping, and then I will take only one sector and go deeper and see how difficult it is, okay, to do the energy transition and to achieve the zero targets. So the first thing is when you talk about the ocean economy, everything that you have learned of economics in land doesn't apply. To start, oceans are interconnected. 70% of the biosphere, produce 60% of all the oxygen, absorb 50% of all the heat. All life comes from the ocean. The ocean is subject to the law of the sea, not to the sovereignty typical rules that we have. The law of the sea has 4 different layers of jurisdiction, more than 30 international agencies dealing with the ocean. You have economic exclusive zone, contingent zone, territorial waters, the high seas, the area, and the water column. So it's a little bit more difficult to manage. Also, at the oceans, living marine resources move, and most of the actors move through vessels. So it's very difficult to pinpoint. To make even things more complicated, in the oceans, you don't have private property, okay? And thirdly, you, instead of talking about square kilometers, you talk about cubic kilometers. So it's a very, very complicated scenario. To make things simple, we have taken an approach on how we can define the ocean economy in a way that could be feasible for the purposes of economic and trade policy. The first element is that the blue economy is a vehicle, it's not an objective in itself, to try to ensure sustainable use and conservation of marine resources, whether for the commons or whether for the countries themselves on their sovereign rights. Now, to do that, we have devised a classification. UNCTAD was the first agency that proposed a classification of ocean economy. And we identify 6 good sectors and 6 services sectors and 1 hybrid sector. The good sectors include marine fisheries, aquaculture and hatcheries, seafood processing, sea minerals, shipboard equipment and parts, high technology and other manufacturers. Then on services, marine and coastal tourism, trading fishery services, marine transport, port services, coastal marine and environmental services, marine research and development, and then the hybrid, which is energy. So this classification is done through HS code, harmonized system codes to trade and trace goods across the border according to the World Customs Organization, and also on services using the W120 and the UNCPC classification. It's outside. You can take a look. It's a thick document, but it's traced to the level of 6 digits. And we can follow flows. Okay? Now, as we know, climate change is affecting a lot the oceans, the living organisms there, and all economic activities. We started, due to this classification, to be able to trace the flow of ocean economic trade since 2012. So we can go to the past. And we have traced it recently until 2021. We're going to have data from 2022 soon. I'm waiting. And the last 2 years, of course, they come lower because we had the COVID crisis and just starting the COVID recovery in 2021. So we can follow both goods and services. Now, how this is structured as what we have the data of today. First, as a consequence of the COVID crisis, basically all oceans services went down in value and in volume due to the lockdown measures, especially on tourism. and many other coastal services. Then goods for the first time move up in value, okay? And they continued to flow even with the measures because we needed high technology goods and we needed food products during the lockdown measures. So the value is about 1.6 trillion and you have about 808 billion in goods and 801 billion in services. All these sectors are related to about 150 million jobs worldwide, particularly in coastal and small island developed states. Now, who are the main actors? And this tells you a totally different way you see the world today. The main exporters of oceans-based goods are mainly in Asia. Okay? They dominate almost 45% of all the trade, followed by Europe, and in this case, Europe includes not only European Union, but include Russia, okay? And that's the second biggest actor, followed by the Americas. So as you can see, even if the US is a very important country in economic terms, in the oceans it's not the most important actor, even if you put all the Americas together. So this is a very interesting approach on who are the main actors and who will be the main affected or benefiting from the ocean blue economy. Now, something that we realized from our research, and this is a slide focusing mainly on developing countries, not developed countries, that in the ocean economy, developing countries are quite diversified. And this was very interesting finding compared to the green or land economy. In the green land economy, developing countries are mainly exporters of commodities, primary goods. In the ocean economy, we found that developing countries, and you can see the case of India, Turkey, Thailand, Mexico, export and trade on almost all of them, which is a very interesting angle. So there are more value-added products in the blue economy, and there are more services in the blue economy, which is very interesting for policies in your countries if you want to achieve diversification. Now, when we're looking at, Malik was very good on explaining the issue of non-tariff measures. This is how trade is regulated besides the tariff. You know, I can do the tariff analysis, but they are very diverse and it will take more time. But non-tariff measures, you could see that there is a clarity pattern according to the products, okay? If you the first three categories, fishery, seafood processing, and sea minerals, these are usually primary and processed products that are linked to human consumption. In this case, the most preeminent type of non-tariff measures are sanitary measures, okay? Followed by technical measures and then by some export controls. In the case of chips, high technology, and other manufacturers that you have high value, that they are based on machinery, instruments, etc., basically the type of measures are mainly technical measures, and obviously sanitary measures almost drop or not exist because they are used for human consumption in the same way. Now, here is basically the overview. Now we're going to start to go deeper. I'm going to take two examples of how the blue economy is evolving, two emerging sectors that call our attention when we're doing the analysis. One is seaweed, a very humble product, consumed in Asia for thousands of years. In the last 30 years, the exports and trade and production of seaweed have tripled. It's going at almost two-digit level. It's happening not only in Asia now, it's being produced in Africa and in Latin America, and it's a very ecological product, very low ecological footprint. You don't need land, you don't need water, you don't need fertilizers. It can be used for food and non-food purposes, so it's growing very fast. So this is why it's important always to have some specific and zoom-in approach, because there may be opportunities in many areas that you were not thinking existed. The second group that was very important, and this is in relation to oceans and how to avoid pollution. This comes from ONTAG. ONTAG has been advocating this for a long time already, a couple of years. The issue that we have a concern about plastics, right? Basically fossil fuel-based polymers. And Malik gave you all the data about plastic pollution, and you have a negotiation right now on the INC, last one in Ottawa, next time in Busan, on how we're going to regulate production, trade, and post-use and disposal of plastics and plastic waste. Now, what we found out is that in the market there are many materials that are of natural origin but also of mineral origin that can be used to substitute plastic today, that are in form of primary form but also in value added. And there is a lot of innovation about it due to the a negative perception that plastic is taking place also in consumers. And we found that in non-plastic materials that include some minerals like aluminum and glass that we have seen it, okay, but also natural materials coming from biomass, including seaweed, but also natural fibers like jute, produced in Bangladesh, by the way, but also cellulose and paper and many other products that have, again, a lower ecological footprint and a lower emissions generation in production can be used today. And the value of that trade is almost 1/3 of the plastics. So we are producing and we have capacity of substitution. Now, for this substitution, there is a comparative interesting advantage for developing countries and another for developed countries. For developing countries is that it is funny that to do the ecological transition, you have to use less synthetic products, right? That are more complex and that might have more polluting chemical composition and also may produce more pollution in production. Then what's the best alternative? Natural products. So you will need significant amount of biomass of different sorts to be able to enable the green transition. It is funny, everybody's focusing on industrial products like solar panels, but very few are focusing on the value of natural products. So it is funny also that we want to do a green transition, but not on natural, please. No, it has to go in parallel. And in this case, there is a huge comparative advantage, and you can see the values now. We can do also per country. Now, going more on to the NDCs, which is the issue that we were concerned. We're doing a mapping on NDCs. This is not just published, this is preview, okay? This is not yet published. Please don't quote me yet. We're preparing for the SIDS conference to have some material. So the idea was to start looking at what were the sectors and the areas where small island development states, in the case of sustainable use, because you have two types of NDCs. Those focuses on sustainable use and those focusing on conservation. In conservation, you don't use. There is no economic activity. You want to preserve the ecosystem. In sustainable use, you want to use in a way that you don't destroy the ecosystem and can produce for generations. So I focus mainly on the economic angle. And I found that in the case of SIDS, they were very active in some sectors that may be very important for livelihoods, but not necessarily are the largest in emission terms. For example, fisheries. It's very important for livelihood, for exports, but it's not the most emitting sector. Instead, tourism, which is the second green, is one sector where you have a lot of emissions and perhaps a higher range in the GDP of many SIDS, but it's the second most included type of commitment. Why? Because many SIDS seem to be more concerned about the impact of climate change on fisheries and aquaculture than on tourism at this stage. You have also commitments almost in all oceans-based sectors by SIDS, and it's funny, they only produce less than 1% of global emissions, but they are taking many more commitments and many more actions in both mitigation and adaptation in the blue economy than many of the big blue economy countries. And I will prove that here and in the case of fishery. Here, you can see a second analysis also on SIDS of the type of NDCs. And the big majority applies usually to adaptation because they have concerns. Again, they are not emitting a lot, but they will have to pay the bill of the impacts, with two exceptions. In the case of cross-sectoral and maritime transport, there are most of the commitments, and on ocean renewable energy, most of the commitments are mitigation because, again, maritime transport is a polluting sector, and renewable energy is about mitigation in itself. That's the overall purpose. Finally, small island development states, basically 3/4 of all the commitments are conditional. So basically they need technical assistance, financial assistance, transfer of technology. If this doesn't happen, they will be able to comply. And this is a very interesting angle of NDCs, that not all NDCs are the same. And also an important point coming from Malik's presentation. Again, you have commitments to submit. You have commitment to report. You have commitment to revise your NDCs. But doesn't tell you how the language of the SDG is going to be. Doesn't tell you that what's a bound commitment or an unbound commitment. Doesn't tell you about a binding commitment versus a best endeavor. Doesn't tell you about necessarily the time frame or how much it's going to cost. It depends on what the country puts in. So the variability of the commitment is huge. Some of the commitments are not even commitments, are best endeavor or pledges. Some of them are even descriptive. They don't imply a commitment. Why? Because in the environmental world, usually they use a tool called National Action Plans that tend to do that instead of a specific commitment WTO type. And there is not a set of modalities in NDCs, just a questionnaire. So it's very difficult to do comparisons. What Malik has been trying to do and I have been trying to do is very difficult due to the diversity of the universe we are analyzing. However, this is important to know that developing countries are willing to do efforts, and in the case of seeds, it's immense the efforts for their size and their responsibility, but they need support. And now let's see the reality of the support. You see this pie chart? Everything in green is official development assistance to everything else but oceans. Only 1.6% of all global official development assistance go to ocean, and it's 70% of the biosphere. So you have tons of commitments, you have a lot of effort, but nobody's putting any money. This is the reality. We're not putting our money where our mouth is. You know, big contradiction. Now, I did that part just to give you the overview. I'm going to take you. UNTAC has been working very much into oceans economy sector, what is maritime transport, deal with our colleagues from DTL. And the other, in our branch, we have been working on fisheries. Now, I'm going to give you a case study, okay, on how the energy transition is looking. I presented this already at the Trade and Development Commission last week. For those who were there, please, I'm sorry if I have to repeat, but it's important we make things clear. Why we decide to focus on the fishery sector? First, it's very important for the purpose of food security. It's the lowest carbon animal protein in the planet. Many nations, especially seas and coastal countries, depend on it culturally. Livelihoods, many people involved. Imagine you have 40 million direct fishers in the world. Just to give you an idea, when you're talking about seafarers, people involved in maritime transport, it's only 2 million. There are 20 times more fishers than people doing trading in boats. Okay? So this is a very labor-intensive sector. Now, why we need a just energy transition here? Obviously, the objective will be to have zero carbon foods, but also all sectors have to contribute to the transition, and all sectors have to contribute to the Paris Agreement objectives. There must be difference among them because in previous research in the UNTAC Trade and Environment Review of 2021, we identified that the 3 sectors that will suffer the most from climate change were going to be agriculture, fisheries, and tourism. And these are essential activities in developing countries. Also in some developed countries. Japan, for example, is very important on fisheries, and for Europe is very important on tourism, Southern Europe, and they are facing very heavy heat waves. So it's affecting everybody. Now, why we also are focusing on fisheries? Because all the fishery sectors run on marine diesel, all of it. The only area not covered is non-motorized vessels, basically sailboats that are basically from mainly in developing countries. Now, there is also a big challenge in the transition that in the case of fisheries, you have a big sector, large sector with 80% of the sector, which is small-scale fisheries. So usually poor, low technology sector. Continue. Now, how significant is fisheries in trade value? Trade of global fisheries is about 179 billion, and the entire value chain of fisheries is 400 billion. Now, when we did the analysis to try to define which were the emissions on the fishery sector, we found very heterogeneous sources of data. So we decided to do a range, and from the lowest estimate to the highest estimates today, it will be about 0.1 to 0.5 of all the emissions. If you compare it with maritime transport is 3%. So it will be obviously smaller than maritime transport, but still emits some. Now, the type of estimates, I don't know if we have the time, but they were 3 main sources. IMO, that International Maritime Organization, using automatic identification system in vessels, but usually cover mainly vessels of more than 400 and 500 gross tonnage, and international shipping, so mainly not fisheries. Very low estimates of 40 million tons of CO2. We went to, and this is interesting for members, there is still a depository of data by Kyoto Protocol Annex 1 country, mainly developed countries. And we found the data on the emissions of fisheries, and many people didn't know. Even the countries were not aware that they were notifying the data, so it was very funny. So we got the data, and we're going to show it today. And finally, you have academic sources that say that the numbers are higher because most of the vessels measures, the universe for measuring vessels is very small, usually 10 to 20% only. Now, we have also a big problem in terms of data that we still put in money where we shouldn't. There's still $2.1 billion among 30 OECD countries, mainly developed countries, given subsidies to fuel in fisheries today. So if you want to enable the transition, why you're funding fossil fuel? You know, a contradiction between the objectives, but it's happening today. Now, some challenges to consider. If you see the graph, the largest fleets and the larger emitters are in Asia, followed by China. I have China specifically. I decided to disaggregate it to contrast with the size of Asia, so it's not only China. But if you check Africa and the Americas and Europe, they have a little bit similar level of emissions, but very different size of fleets. In the case of Europe, it's not very big in numbers, but very big vessels. In the case of Africa, you have a significant number of vessels, but most of them are unmotorized, but those that are of middle size or industrial level tend to pollute, are not very new, and the Americas is more or less equal. Now, we have a partial view of reality, and we have, besides the case of emission, a big problem to address in the case of fisheries, which is managing stocks, which have been continuously declining. About 34% of all global stocks are already under sustainability levels. I'll translate in an easier manner. They are depleted. Okay? And another point that people don't tend to know is that we tend to capture today about 90 million tons of fish from the seas. This is only half of the global demand. The other half is covered by aquaculture. So we reach the limit. I'll make it even easier. We have no more fish. All the fish of all the oceans only cover half of the fish we are eating. Okay? So see how dangerous is the situation today. Finally, there is not a specific plan for the carbonization of the fishery sector, and fossil fuel subsidies still there. Now, here is the data from Annex 1 Kyoto Protocol parties. This was interesting because over the last 30 years, they have been reducing their emissions. Why? Because of two main measures. First, improvement in energy efficiency, still using fossil fuel, but they are improving. And second, they are reducing their fleets because there is no more fish, so why to build more vessels? So it has been a kind of a consequence of the reality. Only one country has done above, which is Norway, because they still have to do more day of fishing to catch the same fish. So it's also an ecological problem, but they also reduced emissions but went up again. Now, we decided to do a different analysis than the one that Malik and team did on NDCs. Instead of looking at all, let's see what the NDCs of the 10 largest seafood exporters in the world say. Okay? So these are the 10 countries that produce and export more fish. Okay? What they say. We found that only 3 countries have direct measures to do something. China, energy efficiency savings and emission reduction technology in equipment and fishery. That's very interesting. Vietnam improved energy efficiency and conversion rates. This means the amount of fuel used to capture in Vietnam. And in Ecuador, they included in the climate strategy, not adaptation, but mitigation, the sectors of fisheries and aquaculture as a priority. As you can see, there is a big variety of the type of commitments. But these were the only countries that had direct measures of the first 10 doing business. The second group is indirect measures, and that basically means that these measures can help fisheries, but are not meant necessarily to reduce emissions, or can help the oceans, but not necessarily reduce emissions. The first is Russian Federation, that they would like to improve fishing management activities, especially in the Arctic, and there is an Arctic Treaty, an Arctic Council on the matter, because it's getting also, the ice is disappearing, so there could be opportunities for fisheries, so they need to manage that, especially in the economic exclusive zone. Chile has plans for adaptation of the fisheries and aquaculture sectors. They are very important in export terms, and they need to adapt to the difficulties they are facing, especially in relation to certain diseases for aquaculture and of the movement and migration patterns of the fish, because fish is going deeper and to the poles because it's getting warmer. So it's completely changing. Canada is pledging protecting 25% of their ocean by 2025 and 30% by 2030. Something interesting, Thailand mentioned very indirectly that they will do something about adaptation in food security, but doesn't mention fisheries. But interesting, 3 countries that are among the top 10 exporters of fish, India, Netherlands, and Norway, say nothing about it. Okay, so a big concern, because also they are big exporters and producers. So regulatory frameworks, you have the IMO strategy, but that's for maritime transport. Marginally can apply to very large fishing vessels, but it's not meant to do that. You have European Union is starting to include shipping fisheries in the monitoring, reporting, and verification systems, especially maritime transport, and EU emissions trading system, but fisheries is excluded, so it's not really covered either. And we have the WTO Fish Subsidies Agreement that cover subsidies that contribute to IUU fishing and fishing on overfished stocks and fishing in the high seas. But it has not dealt yet, because it's under negotiation, with the issue of subsidies to overcapacity and overfishing. One of the important areas listing on the prohibition on overcapacity are subsidies to fuels. I was surprised about the text being the main objective an environmental and sustainability objective. The prohibition currently in the text talks about subsidies that contribute to overfishing, including in an illustrative manner subsidies that contribute to operational costs, such as fuel, ice, and bait. What surprises me, if they didn't qualify the word fuel, they mention any type of fuel. So there will be a prohibition of subsidizing even renewable energy. So I was very surprised that they didn't differentiate. Our recommendation have been that you need to include the word fossil fuels if you want to be effective and enable the transition. Now, how we manage the transition towards lower emissions? There are several measures that we can take today and that we can take later. The ones that stand out as the most ready available to enable the energy transition in fisheries are energy efficient measures, changing the energy for less consuming energy engines, and this is what Europe, Japan, and many have ordered, and I think it's an interesting, China has also done it, so it's an interesting one and at hand with current technology. The second one will be start using green biofuels, fourth generation, meaning coming from agricultural waste, but we can produce them also with seaweed, which we have in abundant matter. The problem is we have problems of distribution of biofuels. I talked to the industry and asked, excuse me, gentlemen, where do you get biofuels for your vessels? Say, no, there is no port yet where we can get biofuels. So it's an issue that the technology is there, the fuels need to be produced, but there is no delivery system. Then we have the issue of green methanol and liquid natural gas being applied some in the shipping industry, but you have significant challenges in terms of retrofitting, storage, safety, and also limited potential to decarbonize because you're still using a fossil fuel in your engine. Less polluting, less emitting carbon, but it still is. The third option in fuel terms is green hydrogen and green ammonia, but these options do not exist yet today, even in prototype terms. There is only one vessel running on green ammonia from Singapore and Australia, and it's a tug vessel, not a fishing vessel, not even a maritime transport vessel. So the technology is not mature. Second, to produce green ammonia, you need green hydrogen, and then you need green renewable energy sources. So it's a 3 steps of investment in green in 3 steps to get to the fuel. And something important for delegations and in their planning is that we are very advanced in renewable energy in terms of electricity generation, but we are not at the same level in the fuel area. And this is going to be very important for all transport, for fisheries, and for activities that are intense in fuels. And also many of these activities have a direct impact on trade. Finally, you also have alternative engines, and there are some prototypes for small-scale fisheries for electric and hybrid vessels. But again, this is not yet wide. I have found a couple of vessels, one in Barbados, one in Norway. So I'm still trying to chase them, but these are very small prototypes. Port infrastructure for whatever alternative fuels you decide to use or members agree to use in the future do not exist. So will have to be constructed, built, introduced. And finally, you have all these alternatives, but each alternative has some pros and cons. So it's not yet clear the path forward. We're testing many technologies, and this is not a normal. This happens in any transition, ecological transition or energy transition. The same happened in the 19th century because there was a competition between steam and fossil fuels, gasoline and kerosene. At the beginning, steam was much more developed because we have the train system. But at the end, fossil fuels proved to be more reliable for the road system and maritime transport. So sometimes it was not an issue of the technological level, it's an issue of is the technology be ready to use today? I'll continue because we have many things. We did some case studies on how different continents are trying to, or countries are trying to address the issue. In Europe, they've said that they're mainly facing fossil fuels through energy efficiency technologies, and I mentioned, but also using smart fishing practices in the weight of the nets and how they fish and how they target the fish to reduce the amount of days at sea. And they are trying to apply circular economy, especially related to fish waste. And they say they may follow very closely what happens in shipping because they may develop the technology first. In the Asia Pacific, they forgot on targets to also enable clean energy and emission reductions, but they mentioned that they needed investment, target policy, and transfer of technology. In Ecuador, it was interesting. They say for the vessels, we're applying also energy efficiency, but we're getting better results at port in the manufacturing, using solar power, wind, and others. So it's obviously in the manufacturing phase that energy transition can go faster. And finally, we have a very interesting private sector case that it's setting their own objectives to eliminate emissions by 2040, and they are using so far 3 angles: energy efficiency, alternative fuels, but an interesting one, which was carbon capture. So this same company is investing and buying areas in the coastline in Mozambique and Namibia to plant mangroves, afforestation, so they can compensate the carbon they generate through fossil fuels with creating carbon sinks. Finally, some policy consideration for member states. At some point, we need to start discussing that we need a target, a plan, a measure for the energy transition of fishing fleets because their needs are very special and there are many stakeholders that are weak. We may need to think how to do that in the next iteration of NDCs, that we were looking at what SIDS are doing. We need a global harmonized system for data collection, doesn't exist for fisheries. We need to explore and adopt these energy efficient measures because they're immediate, but also the issue of fossil fuel or sustainable fuel options, we need to check the different possibilities of technological options and invest in research and development. We need to phase out fossil fuel subsidies. Don't put your money where you don't need it. Put the money where you need it. And finally, avoid the coupling, and that is a very important message. When we're going to different negotiations on different sustainability issues, we are having a competition among sustainability objectives. So in the case of the oceans, you have 2 big or 3 big sustainability objectives that don't always, we take always measures at the same time or in parallel. One is management of the stocks because we're getting run out of fish, and the other is decarbonization. You can decarbonize, but if you don't manage the stocks, you're going to run out of fish, even if you do it cleanly. And also, even if you manage stocks and you don't do the energy transition, you're going to still pollute in your air and your ocean. So they have to go in parallel. You cannot decouple the cake in an easy manner. So sorry to be so long. I have a last slide because this work is very complicated. This is to help delegates. This is the timeline of all the oceans big events from now to June 2025, where we'll have the Ocean Conference. These are major events and major diplomatic activities where you need to put your eyes where commitments are going to start being developed in order to deliver by 2025. And as you have the UNFCCC track, you have the ocean track. This includes the UNFCCC. Look at it. One important milestone from the UNCTAD point of view is that we're going to organize the Ocean Economy Forum on trade-related aspects. It will be the 5th. We have organized already 4 to mainstream all recommendations on the economic side from the entire Geneva, Roma, Nairobi axis in order to enable a clear mandates, commitments, and recommendation for the 3rd Ocean Forum, conference in Nice in 2025. I hope this helps. Sorry if it was too long. You have all the sources here and outside. And thank you very much for your attention. sorry, to